It's midnight in Paris. This is World Roundup. I'm Mark Owen. The breaking news this hour: Donald Trump convicted in the hush money fraud trial on all 34 felony counts against him. He makes history as the first former US president to be convicted in such a manner. This is World Roundup. Thank you for being with us. We're dedicating our coverage to the Trump trial and this sensational result, the conviction of Donald Trump on all 34 felony counts that he was facing in what became known as the hush money fraud trial. His reaction, as one might expect, was very belligerent outside the court. He blamed everybody but himself for his misfortune.
This was a disgrace. This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here.
Donald Trump, in that characteristic voice, blaming everybody but himself for his misfortune. The fact of the matter is a jury took just over 11 hours to convict him on all 34 counts that he was facing in what became known as the hush money trial. Monte Francis has been following it from the start. He's with us now. Monte, in terms of what we've seen here, yes, history has been made, but a remarkable evening. What kind of reactions have we had?
Yeah, so we're getting in reactions, minute by minute here. The latest is that the Trump campaign sent out a fundraising email in which Trump said in all capital letters, "I am a political prisoner." So that is more comment from him from what we just saw, in addition to the comments he made outside court there. The jury spent, like you said, about 11 hours and 43 minutes to be exact, to make this decision over 2 days, finding him guilty of all 34 counts of falsifying business records, usually misdemeanors. Those were charged as felonies because it was done in the furtherance of another crime. The jury decides on guilt or innocence, so they've made their decision. The judge will then decide on the punishment, and Judge Juan Merchan has set a sentencing date for July 11th. We'll see what that could be. That could be prison time. Most legal experts say that that's probably not likely. Maybe it's more going to be probation, but we can't say Donald Trump is a convicted felon at this point in time, and he's also the presumptive Republican nominee in the upcoming election.
As you said earlier, unprecedented.
Yeah.
Unprecedented. Monte Francis, thank you for the moment. Let's bring in Frederick T. Davis, a former federal prosecutor. Fred is also a lawyer in New York and in Paris. Fred, always a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you for being with us. As Monte was just saying, this is an unprecedented moment. Can I get your thoughts first, though, on the post that Donald Trump's just made online saying that he's a political prisoner? Now, here on this channel, we report about political prisoners. They're usually behind bars somewhere. Donald Trump tonight is a free man. He's walked free from the court.
Yes, this is a man who has said that the election in 2016 was rigged, even though he won it. The election of 2020 was rigged, which he lost. And he's already said that the election of 2024, which hasn't happened yet, is rigged. I mean, his basic view is, as you've already said on the air, everybody is at fault except for himself. And so he knows no limits, as far as I can see, in terms of the verbiage and the language he uses to describe this. So it's just beginning. He's going to try to raise funds. We've already seen the right-wing press are closing ranks around him, and he's going to do as much as he can, which he's done pretty successfully so far, at using this kind of thing to confirm his support.
As your title says, Professor of Law at Columbia, also former federal prosecutor and lawyer in New York and Paris. You know the law, sir, and that's why we call upon you. What does Trump do next, legally?
Well, the next thing that happens is that there will be a sentencing set for July 11. There's a process for that. He will be interviewed by a service that then does a report. The prosecutor will weigh in with his recommendation as to the sentence, and he, of course, can be heard. Members of the public might actually ask to be heard on the sentence. My own view, which I think has already been reflected on this program, is that he will not be sentenced to prison. It'll be very interesting to see if the prosecutor seeks his imprisonment. I really don't know whether he will or not. So that'll take place on July 11, unless it's postponed. And then he gets an appeal. And an appeal, unlike a French case, is not a second trial. It really is a question: was this trial fair? Were the instructions to the jury accurate? Were the rulings on the evidence accurate? And on that, I think that the prosecutor's in very good shape. This judge tried a really, really careful trial. I think he maintained absolute decorum in the courtroom, and I'm not aware of a single ruling of his that struck me as particularly vulnerable to an appeal.
Fred, bear with me a second, please. We'll come back to you as soon as we can. We're going to go to Washington to David Smith, who's the bureau chief for the Guardian newspaper in the US Capitol. David, of course, has been following the story from day one too. David, thanks for being with us here in France 24. We always appreciate your time, and I know you're busy, so I won't keep you for too long. Give us a sense, David, of what this means for Trump going forward politically.
Yeah, it's obviously a historic day. First time ever a former US president's had a criminal conviction, and really America joining those democracies who sent a message that no one is above the law and former political leaders can be held accountable. And Washington's been fixated for weeks on, as you say, the political meaning of this trial. Certainly historians care a great deal about it. Journalists have been all over it. I think late night comedians will have a field day. Does it actually matter to the voters? And there's plenty of evidence that there are millions of voters out there who don't really care about this. Remember, the trial was not televised live like some of the famous cases such as O.J. Simpson or Oscar Pistorius in South Africa. And I think that dulled the impact a bit. You didn't have that same drama and spectacle. Just anecdotally, while I'm out interviewing voters, some say they don't really care. They're not following it that closely. And as you'd expect, that's especially true of Donald Trump's core supporters. I just don't think they are going to be moved by this. They buy into his rhetoric that this is politically motivated and the state is weaponized against him. All of that said, I think we also should remember, though, that presidential elections in America are extremely close these days. In 2016, in the Electoral College, Trump won by about 78,000 votes in 3 states. 4 years later, Joe Biden won by an even smaller margin in swing states. So really, everything matters. Gaza matters, the economy, abortion. And so I think this could have an impact on some independent voters. And the opinion polls suggest that while the majority of Americans are not going to shift on this, certainly there are some in the middle, some on the margins who just feel uneasy about voting to elect a convicted criminal to the White House.
David, I'll pause you there. And if you can stay with us, please do. David Smith of the Guardian newspaper, their bureau chief in Washington. I've got Monte Francis in the studio. Frederick T. Davis, of course, joining us via a Skype link. Monte, can you give us more reaction on the situation? You spoke earlier about Joe Biden's response.
Yes, so the Biden camp is saying no one is above the law. The White House is saying we respect the rule of law. We have no further comments, so they're not really going into too much detail there. I think I mentioned earlier the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, has scheduled a news conference for 6:30 p.m. In New York. That's 12:30 a.m. Here in Paris. One of the things I was thinking about as David was speaking there was Trump had said in his comments, the real verdict is on November 5th. And this kind of runs into the theory, or goes on with a theory of him running to sort of escape his legal woes. And I've heard this question come up before, and maybe one of our legal experts can answer this. Can Trump pardon himself? I believe because this is a state case, not a federal case, he couldn't do that. I think it's also an open legal question whether a president can pardon himself in the first place. But, I think the assumption here is that Donald Trump will be a convicted felon going forward.
Monte, let me pause you and let's put that question to Frederick T. Davis, legal expert who was waiting to come back in and speak to us. Fred, I don't know whether you heard what Monte said. Can Trump pardon himself should he be elected in November?
In this case, he certainly cannot. The pardon power under the Constitution applies only to federal convictions, federal criminal matters, and this is a state matter, so he can't do it. And as your colleague said, we just don't know, even in a federal case, whether someone can pardon oneself, just because it's so absurd. I mean, it's never happened, and it shouldn't happen. But if he is convicted on one of the two remaining cases, two of which are federal, that could come up.
Indeed, we are in a situation, though, Fred, where I think it's fair to say unprecedented is a word that describes it very well. And it does seem it's bordering on the ridiculous how this is being done. Trump comes out of court. He immediately calls the judge corrupt. He then lays into everybody. He says the whole world has gone to hell. And he says this has been very divisive. But some would say Trump is the most divisive figure in the US today.
Well, he absolutely is. What's really going on here is there's so many things happening at once. But one thing, keep in mind, a constant theme of Trump's participation in our body politic here is to say you can't trust anything. The system is rigged. The elections are rigged. Everything's rigged, including the judicial system. And as a lawyer and as a former prosecutor and as a citizen, I hope that the opposite of that is becoming apparent. This judge tried a very, very, very careful case. The prosecutor delayed bringing it just to make sure he had all of the necessary proof. This was a system that worked rather remarkably. And to me, the issue of whether Trump is elected, of course, is very, very important. But long term, it's also very important to see whether, the people of the United States continue to believe in their institutions. I hope they do.
Because Trump was very clear outside the court, Fred, was he not? He called the judge corrupt. He said this was a rigged, disgraceful trial.
Yeah, that's his constant theme, and as we've said before, he knows no limits. This judge is not corrupt. There's a transparency to this system. There will be an appeal. Trump had the opportunity to testify and didn't do it. I mean, I think that's clearly his legal right. It's interesting to me to see whether he'll pay politically for that. It is a bit odd for him to say this whole thing is made up, and I barely met the lady, but he didn't say so under oath and was too scared to do so. But the real issue is the system working? I think it did.
Fred, bear with us, please. Frederick T. Davis, former federal prosecutor, lawyer in New York and Paris, and law professor at Columbia. Let's go back to David Smith, the Guardian's bureau chief in Washington. David, as journalist to journalist, what a story to cover. It's had everything, hasn't it? Former president up on criminal charges. First time ever we've had a former adult film actress. We've had a former Playboy bunny. You couldn't make this up, could you? This is a remarkable story to cover.
I feel like everything you've said really sums up the entire Donald Trump era from the beginning. It does defy the imagination of novelists and others. And to illustrate your point, just as we've been on air, I got a message from one of my editors saying, what a time to be alive. This has been an incredible political era in America. Very exciting for journalists and very dark for many people because of who Trump is and what he's done. This is, of course, the man who famously said, I think in 2016, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose any voters. And there has been that theme that he's an incredibly lucky politician surviving scandal after scandal. And these things just seem to bounce off him. Today is interesting, important as a moment of reckoning where, as your guest was saying, that the system has worked and Trump finally was held to account. At his rallies, he, perhaps jokingly, maybe half jokingly, sort of talks about what would his mother and father have thought about him being in court, facing criminal charges now, a criminal conviction. I think this will weigh on him. You saw his demeanor coming out of court, the way he was frowning darkly. This is a big blow to him, and yet, of course, what we don't know is whether, having lost in the court of law, will he go on to lose in the court of public opinion? He may yet, extraordinarily, to your point about how you couldn't make this up, he may yet go on to win back the White House, which is something historians would then talk about hundreds of years from now that such a thing could happen. And even in the nearer future, in July, he's due to be sentenced on the 11th of July, and just a few days later, we'll have the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. That will be a coronation of Trump as the presidential nominee, now the first presidential nominee in history to have a criminal conviction. And certainly you will see Republicans there, as you already doing in the last few minutes, rallying around him. My email inbox here is full of messages from senators denouncing this as a miscarriage of justice, confidently predicting that Trump will be acquitted on appeal. And you'll hear a lot more of that from right-wing media as well. It's worth remembering this verdict is coming in a very divided nation, where there are plenty of commentators saying that Trump is the victim and the martyr here.
Indeed, Trump making that remark as he came out of the court that the country's gone to hell, his words, it's a divided mess. Some people will point the finger at Trump and say that he's in many ways responsible for what is going on. However, someone who is riding that situation to his advantage. Yes,
I think many would regard him as the most divisive American president, certainly in modern times. Remember when he first launched his campaign in 2015, he talked about the border and immigrants, described Mexicans as criminals and rapists and so on. And that demonization of the other has really set the tone for the years that followed. We, of course, had the white supremacist march in Charlottesville, where there were civil rights protesters. He praised very fine people on both sides. If you think about his rhetoric towards the media, the enemy of the people, and so on, so much of his political career has been about divisiveness, and sadly, I think that has been the story of this past decade in America, political tribalism and polarization. You see that now in Congress, where there's far less gets done. There's far less overlap between Democrats and Republicans, and time again, the Trump criminal verdicts, the impeachments, all the other scandals. There's this immediate default where Democrats denounce him and Republicans rush to defend him. And as I say, already in the aftermath of this verdict, you're seeing a similar pattern. There's sorting by class and race and geography in America. It is a very divided nation. And certainly you hear analysts say maybe Donald Trump is not the sole cause of that, but he has certainly been an accelerant.
David, I'll get more from you in a second. Let's just remind people and tell people who may just be joining us that Donald Trump convicted on all 34 counts in the hush money trial. He said outside the court it was a rigged, disgraceful trial. He said that he's a very innocent man. He blamed the Biden administration. He said that it's a disgrace and the country's gone to hell. It's a divided mess. The jury wasn't divided. They were unanimous. Trump convicted on all 34 charges against him. We'll get more from our guests and from Monte here in the studio after hearing from some voices outside the court, reactions from people in the street to the news that Donald Trump is now a convicted felon.
I don't know what to say. I did not think that this was actually going to happen, and I can't believe it. It's about time he was held accountable for something. I can't believe it. It's amazing.
Man, I don't think that's really true. I mean, I don't know all the details about his case, but I truly think he didn't do it. My fault. Free Trump. And I just want to see the truth come out, and I just want to see the true stories.
Only two voices, but two voices split with their opinions, and maybe indicative, Monte, about how the US, as David Smith was just testifying to us there, is a split country. Donald Trump in many ways has taken advantage of the split, riding the chaos in some ways and clearly taking advantage of that. His tactic seems to be to blame everybody but himself for what has gone on and to raise doubt about the process, the institutions that make up the United States, whether it's the electoral system or the legal system. It's never, ever his fault. It's always a fault of something else.
I think that is a really excellent point, Mark. I mean, it's not just Trump, though, that is calling the legitimacy of the judicial system into question, or the courts, the electoral system. the whole Republican Party, really. I mean, you saw Speaker of the House Mike Johnson today in reaction to this verdict, calling this a shameful day in U.S. history. He was in court, supporting Trump, third in line to the presidency, and is really calling the legitimacy of the proceedings into question. What does this say for institutions when you have party members who are buying into Trump's false claims that the 2020 election was stolen? You have to do so, or you'll be ejected, like Liz Cheney, from the Republican Party. We'll really just have to see how this plays out for him politically. I think no one knows the answer to that question.
Monte, thank you. Let's go back to Frederick T. Davis. Frederick is a federal prosecutor, former federal prosecutor, currently law professor at Columbia, an august organization indeed, and a lawyer in New York and Paris. Frequent guest here, Fred. It's always a pleasure to get your very measured view on these things. From your perspective, what does this mean for Donald Trump now?
Well, we don't know. Look, politically, this is such a weird situation because if anybody who had a sense of shame, or anybody living in what I think of as a real world, and that's, this would be devastating. But he has this amazing ability to turn devastating events to his advantage. He's been doing that, ever since he started into politics. There's some curious things. Will he be allowed to vote for himself? I don't really know New York election law, but in many states, if you're a convicted felon, you can't vote. I believe it to be the case that he would not be allowed to sit on a board of publicly held corporations because you can't have felons on boards. He can run for the president. He can be elected. And we just don't know where all this is going to lead. Ultimately, the issue will be decided, as he says, and I agree with him on this. This will be decided on November 5th, one way or the other. He will be the nominee. And the American people have to look at this situation and make their decision. It's ultimately their decision more than these jurors' decisions that are going to make the difference. That said, this is an amazing verdict and an extremely well-presented case, extremely well-managed case, and it's part of the evolving story. And we'll see where the next steps take us. We have a long way to go.
What do you think his punishment will be, Fred?
I think he will not get prison. I think he faced a risk of prison, very frankly, if he had elected to testify, which under our system is his right to choose to testify or not. If he had testified and had been perceived by this judge as lying under oath, I think under those circumstances, he faced a real risk of being sent away. And I think that's one of the reasons he didn't do it. I think for this circumstance, given the sort of unusual, somewhat technical nature of the crimes he's been convicted of, he will not get sent to prison. He'll have, a fine, which of course to him is not terribly important.
He, from my experience of reporting courts, judges don't have they have a very dim view of someone who's in contempt of court. Trump was, of course, in contempt of court some 10 times. During this trial. I mean, I'm left asking the same question. How does he get away with it?
Well, he gets away with it just because we have a system that favors the defense. He's presumed innocent until an hour and a half ago. This judge really gave him a fair amount of slacks, a fair amount of freedom, at the same time showing and telling him, don't push me too far, Mr. Trump. But Trump is like a little boy. He's like little kids we all grew up with who, every time they're faced with authority, and he has a really good sense of this, will push to see how much he can get away with. I think even Trump at some point realized, this judge, I really do risk being sent away to prison for contempt. And so it's kind of a standoff in that sense. I don't think he'll be sentenced to prison for this conviction.
Fred, star witness Michael Cohen says that Trump's verdict was an important day for the rule of law. Can I get your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure if I want to show up as agreeing with Michael Cohen on too much, but he's right. I mean, look, this was a well-presented case. A number of us has followed this, and I'm a trial lawyer. I love trials, and I learned things in the sense that, for example, calling Michael Pecker as the very first witness was brilliantly thought through and brilliantly done. Here's a guy who likes Trump. I mean, he communicated, Trump is my buddy, and didn't go out of his way to stick it to him. And yet he laid down a devastating narrative of how the two of them and others, including Cohen, sat around a table and said, how can we manipulate the news to help Trump get elected? That's devastating stuff. And it all came out. So I agree with Michael Cohen. I mean, the facts got presented in a very, very good way. We don't know who the jurors are. A number of people have commented that they really paid attention. They're very respectful of everybody in the court. This is the way it's supposed to work. And I agree. It's a moment of triumph for the judicial system of the state of New York.
Jury of 5 women, 7 men. My colleague Monte told me that earlier in our coverage. The slack that you talk about, Frederick, that the judge cut for Trump, was that part of actually him trying to show that this is as fair a trial as we can make it? We are actually giving this man a bit of indulgence in expressing his anger and his ire against the system, but it will be judged and deliberated upon by a jury, and the verdict will be held.
Yeah, what the judge did is, and judges vary all over the lot. My wife used to be a judge on that very court, so I've seen this up close. Judges vary in how they maintain the dignity of the courthouse and the courtroom. I think more than anything else, they do it by being very careful, very unemotional themselves, very careful and disciplined. And Judge Mershon was entirely that way. And I think he had to, as you put it, indulge Trump to some degree. He is an accused defendant. He benefits from the presumption of innocence, and we should tolerate a certain amount of flexibility for them. And yet he made it very clear there are lines here. He made rulings on the admissibility of evidence, which is crucial to the role of a judge. And that's what judges are supposed to do, and he did it, in my opinion.
Frederick T. Davis, for now, bear with us, please. Let's take a listen to our correspondent who was covering the verdict as it was delivered. She is Pamela Falk. She joined us a little earlier. This is what she told us from outside the court, where Trump was convicted on all 34 charges against him.
Well, first of all, you can hear around me the helicopters were immediately dispatched. Thousands of police are walking around, and the security is enormous around the courtroom. As you can hear, some protesters calling out for Trump, some protesters joyfully celebrating the verdict. Just now, the court gave a verdict. Donald Trump is guilty of 34 counts, 34 felonies, each of which could carry a 5-year term, a 6-year term. But the judge has already indicated he doesn't think he will have any jail time. Nonetheless, the judge did allow Trump to leave the courtroom without posting any bond, and the sentencing will be in 6 weeks' time. This was an enormously fast jury decision, a verdict with such a complicated case. You heard the jury come in and ask questions, try to get the instructions straight, and then in the second day of deliberations delivered a verdict on all counts, guilty as charged.
Pamela Falk, our correspondent there outside the court, but Donald Trump has been convicted on all 34 counts in the hush money trial. We'll have more after a short break.